My stepmom tried to take everything my dad left me, but his hidden plan to expose her greed worked, and what followed shattered her world. I never thought I'd inherit everything from a man who barely spoke to me for 20 years, until I realized he had been planning this moment all along. My name is Lucas Bennett, I'm 28 years old, and I work as a real estate attorney in a small firm downtown. Growing up, my relationship with my father Richard was complicated at best, distant and cold at worst. When I was 10, he married Miranda, a woman who seemed sweet enough on the surface but always had this calculating look in her eyes whenever money came up in conversation. My father was a successful businessman who owned several rental properties around the city. He wasn't the type to show affection through hugs or words of encouragement. Instead, he showed love through providing, making sure I had everything I needed for school, college, and getting started in my career. Miranda, on the other hand, was always warm and talkative, constantly reminding everyone how much she sacrificed to take care of our family. She'd been working as an assistant director at an event planning company when she met my father. But after they married, she gradually stopped working, claiming she needed to focus on managing the household. For 18 years, I watched their marriage from the sidelines. My father grew quieter as the years passed while Miranda became more vocal about financial decisions. She'd often make comments about our future and what we've built together whenever discussing the properties or investments. I always found it strange how she'd refer to assets my father had acquired before their marriage, as if they were jointly owned. But I never said anything. It wasn't my place, and honestly, I was too focused on building my own life to pay much attention to their dynamics. When my father passed away suddenly from a heart attack last month, I expected the grief to hit me harder than it did. Instead, I felt this hollow numbness, like I was mourning a relationship that never really existed. The funeral was small, and Miranda played the grieving widow perfectly, dabbing her eyes with tissues and accepting condolences with graceful sorrow. But I noticed how quickly her conversations turned to settling Richard's affairs and making sure everything is handled properly. In the weeks following the funeral, Miranda started calling me almost daily. At first, her calls seemed genuinely caring, asking how I was coping, if I needed anything, suggesting we have dinner together to support each other through this difficult time. But gradually, her questions became more pointed. She'd ask about my father's business relationships, whether I knew anything about his recent investments, if he'd mentioned any changes to his financial planning. When I told her I didn't know much about his business affairs, she'd get this slight edge in her voice, like she didn't quite believe me. "You know, Lucas," she said during one of these calls, "your father and I talked about the future quite a bit in his final months. He was very concerned about making sure the family would be taken care of. I'm sure when we meet with the lawyer we'll be able to work everything out fairly." The way she emphasized family made my stomach twist with unease. There was something proprietary in her tone, as if she'd already decided how things should be divided. The reading of the will was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon at the law office of Henderson and Associates, the firm that had handled my father's legal affairs for over a decade. Miranda arrived wearing a black dress that was expensive but not too expensive, calculated to strike the right note of respectful mourning. She sat across from me in the conference room, her hands folded in her lap, occasionally reaching over to pat my arm in what she probably thought was a comforting gesture. Mr. Henderson, my father's longtime attorney, was a man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of calm demeanor that comes from decades of delivering difficult news to families. He opened the leather portfolio containing my father's will and cleared his throat before beginning to read. "I, Richard James Bennett, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make this my last will and testament." The legal language droned on for several minutes, covering the standard formalities. Miranda sat forward slightly in her chair, her eyes fixed on Mr. Henderson's face with intense concentration. I found myself holding my breath without realizing why. Then came the part that changed everything. "To my beloved wife Miranda Bennett, I leave the sum of $50,000 and my gratitude for the companionship she provided during our marriage." Miranda's face went completely still, like she was processing the words but couldn't quite make sense of them. Mr. Henderson continued reading without pause. "To my son Lucas Bennett, I leave the remainder of my estate in its entirety, including all real property, financial accounts, investments, and personal belongings." The silence in the room was deafening. I felt like someone had just told me I'd won the lottery while simultaneously informing me that the world was ending. Miranda's face had gone from pale to flushed red, her hands gripping the arms of her chair so tightly that her knuckles were white. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Could you repeat that last part?" Mr. Henderson looked at her with the patient expression of someone who'd dealt with shocked beneficiaries many times before. "Mrs. Bennet, you are to receive $50,000. The remainder of the estate, approximately $2 million in total assets, goes to Lucas." Miranda's composure cracked like glass hitting concrete. "That's impossible," she said, her voice rising. "Richard would never—" "We discussed this. He promised me that we'd taken care of together. I've been his wife for 18 years. I gave up my career to take care of him, to manage his household, to be there for him when he was sick. Lucas barely even visited." I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what was happening. $2 million. My father had been worth $2 million, and he'd left almost all of it to me. The son who'd kept his distance, who'd built his own life separate from his family, who'd probably had fewer meaningful conversations with him in the past decade than Miranda had in a single month. "There must be some mistake," Miranda continued, standing up from her chair. "Richard was getting confused in his final months. He wasn't thinking clearly. This will must have been signed when he wasn't competent to make such decisions." Mr. Henderson shook his head calmly. "Mrs. Bennet, I can assure you that your husband was completely lucid when he signed this will. In fact, he updated it just 6 months ago, and we followed all proper procedures to ensure his mental competency. He specifically requested that I explain to you both that these were his final wishes, and that he hoped you would respect his decisions." Miranda turned to look at me, and I saw something in her eyes that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just disappointment or hurt, it was rage mixed with something that looked almost like hatred. "This is your doing, isn't it?" she said, pointing a finger at me. "You manipulated him. You convinced him to cut me out of what's rightfully mine." "Miranda, I had no idea about any of this," I said, finding my voice for the first time since the reading began. "I'm just as surprised as you are. Don't lie to me," she snapped. "You're a lawyer, Lucas. You know how to manipulate people, how to make them think they're making their own decisions when really you're pulling the strings. My husband would never have done this to me voluntarily." Mr. Henderson intervened before I could respond. "Mrs. Bennet, I understand this is difficult news, but I need to ask you to lower your voice. Mr. Bennet made these decisions entirely on his own, and I have detailed notes from our conversations that I can provide if necessary." Miranda stared at him for a long moment, then gathered her purse and coat. "This isn't over," she said, looking directly at me. "I won't let you steal what's mine. Richard built that wealth during our marriage, which makes me entitled to half of it under community property laws. I'll see you in court." She stormed out of the office, leaving me sitting there with Mr. Henderson in awkward silence. He closed the portfolio and looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and concern. "Lucas, I want you to know that your father thought very carefully about these decisions. He came to see me several times over the past year to discuss his estate planning. He was very specific about his wishes, and he asked me to give you this if there were any complications." He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written on it in my father's distinctive handwriting. Inside was a letter that made everything even more confusing and heartbreaking than it already was. "Son," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means Miranda didn't take the news well. And Henderson had to give you this letter. I know we haven't been close, and I know you probably think I don't care about you. The truth is, I've been watching you build your life from a distance, and I'm prouder of you than I ever knew how to say. You became a good man without needing me to guide you every step of the way, and that tells me everything I need to know about your character. I'm leaving you everything because I trust you to do the right thing with it. Miranda has been pressuring me to change my will for months, suggesting that you don't deserve an inheritance because you chose to distance yourself from the family. What she doesn't understand is that you distanced yourself because you saw through her manipulations before I did. You were protecting yourself, and I respected that. I've provided for Miranda because she was my wife and deserves some security, but I won't reward her attempts to control my decisions or alienate me from my only child. Use this inheritance wisely, son. Build something good with it." I read the letter 3 times before the words really sank in. My father had been paying attention all along. He'd understood why I'd kept my distance, and somehow he'd respected me for it. The guilt I'd been carrying about our relationship suddenly felt different. Not lighter, exactly, but more complicated. Over the next few days, Miranda called me constantly. At first, her calls were pleading and emotional. She'd cry on the phone, talking about how scared she was about her future, how she'd given up everything to be my father's wife, how she couldn't understand why he'd betrayed her this way. When the emotional appeals didn't work, she switched to anger and threats. "You think you can just take everything and leave me with nothing?" she said during one particularly heated call. "I know things about your father's business dealings that could complicate your inheritance. I have access to information that might interest the IRS. Don't think you can just walk away from this without consequences." I tried to stay calm during these conversations, but her threats were starting to wear on me. I consulted with my own attorney about the possibility of her contesting the will. He told me that while she could try, her chances of success were minimal, given the clear language of the will and the documentation Mr. Henderson had regarding my father's mental competency. But Miranda wasn't done fighting. I started getting calls from lawyers representing her, asking questions about my relationship with my father, requesting financial records, trying to build a case for undue influence. She was clearly spending the $50,000 she'd inherited on legal fees, determined to get what she saw as her fair share. The harassment escalated when she started showing up at my apartment building, waiting in the lobby to ambush me when I came home from work. She'd follow me to my car, demanding that we work something out and accusing me of ruining her life. I had to ask the building management to restrict her access, but that only made her more desperate and aggressive. Then she did something that crossed a line I didn't even know existed. I'd inherited my father's house along with everything else. A beautiful 3-bedroom colonial in one of the nicer neighborhoods across town. I'd been slowly going through his belongings, trying to decide what to keep and what to donate, when I discovered something that changed my entire understanding of the situation. Hidden in my father's desk drawer was a small notebook filled with dates, times, and detailed descriptions of conversations. It was like a journal, but focused entirely on documenting Miranda's behavior over the past 2 years. Entry after entry described incidents where she'd tried to manipulate him, pressured him about money, or made veiled threats about what would happen if he didn't take care of her properly. One entry, dated just 3 months before his death, particularly stood out. Miranda suggested I should change my will to leave everything to her, claiming that Lucas has never shown proper respect for family. When I refused, she said it would be unfortunate if something happened to me before I could make the right decision. I'm starting to think she might be capable of more than I realized. As I read through the notebook, I felt sick to my stomach. My father hadn't just been documenting Miranda's manipulation, he'd been building a case against her. The final entry was dated 2 weeks before his death. Contacted Henderson about updating security measures. "If something happens to me, I want there to be evidence of her threats. Lucas deserves to know what kind of person he's dealing with." I was still processing this information when my phone rang at 2 in the morning. It was the security company that monitored my father's house. Someone had triggered the silent alarm. "Mr. Bennett, we've detected unauthorized entry at your property on Maple Street. The police have been dispatched, but we wanted to alert you immediately." I threw on clothes and drove to the house as fast as I could, my mind racing with possibilities. When I arrived, police cars were already in the driveway, their lights flashing in the darkness. Officer Martinez, whom I'd spoken with before about Miranda's harassment, met me at the front door. "We caught her red-handed," he said grimly. "She was in your father's study, going through the desk and filing cabinets. She had a suitcase with her, already filled with documents and what looks like jewelry." Through the front window, I could see Miranda sitting in the back of a police car, her face streaked with tears and mascara. She looked smaller somehow, diminished and desperate in a way that might have made me feel sorry for her under different circumstances. "How did she get in?" I asked. "She still had a key," Officer Martinez replied. "Technically, she could argue that she had permission to be here since she lived here during the marriage, but the fact that she disabled the security system and was clearly taking items that don't belong to her makes this pretty clearly breaking and entering with intent to commit theft." As we walked through the house, I could see the extent of Miranda's desperation. She'd torn through my father's personal papers, obviously looking for anything that might give her leverage in her legal battle. The suitcase she'd brought contained not just documents and jewelry, but also small valuable items like my father's watch collection and some rare coins he'd kept in his safe. But what struck me most was finding my father's notebook lying open on the desk, several pages torn out. She'd discovered his documentation of her behavior and had tried to destroy the evidence. Fortunately, she'd only managed to remove a few pages before the alarm brought the police. Officer Martinez showed me the torn pages, which detailed some of Miranda's most manipulative conversations with my father. "She was probably hoping to find something she could use against you," he said. "Instead, she found evidence of her own misconduct. This notebook is going to be very helpful in building our case against her." As I stood in my father's study, surrounded by the chaos Miranda had created in her desperate attempt to claim what she thought was hers, I finally understood the full scope of what my father had been trying to protect me from. This wasn't just about money or inheritance. It was about recognizing the difference between someone who genuinely cares about family and someone who sees family as a means to financial security. The next morning, Miranda was charged with breaking and entering, attempted theft, and destruction of evidence. Her bail was set higher than the remaining money from her inheritance, which meant she had to spend several days in jail before her attorney could arrange for her release. During those days, I had time to think about how I wanted to handle the situation. My first instinct was to throw the book at her, to pursue every possible charge and make sure she paid the full price for what she'd done. But as I reread my father's letter and thought about the kind of person he'd wanted me to be, I realized that revenge wasn't the answer. Miranda had destroyed herself through her own greed and desperation. I didn't need to destroy her further. When her attorney contacted me about the possibility of a plea deal, I agreed to meet with them. Miranda looked terrible. Her hair was unwashed, her clothes wrinkled, and she had the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't slept in days. But there was still defiance in her expression, as if she couldn't quite accept that her plan had failed so completely. "Lucas," she said before her attorney could speak, "I know how this looks, but you have to understand my position. I gave 18 years of my life to your father. I took care of him when he was sick. I managed his household. I was there for him in ways you never were. Doesn't that count for something?" I looked at her for a long moment, trying to find some trace of the woman who'd seemed so caring when I was younger. "Miranda, my father left you $50,000. For most people, that would be a generous inheritance from someone they weren't related to by blood. But it wasn't enough for you, was it?" $50,000 doesn't replace 18 years of marriage," she replied bitterly. "It doesn't compensate me for the career I gave up, the life I put on hold to be his wife." "No," I agreed, "but breaking into my house and trying to steal my inheritance doesn't compensate you for those things either. It just makes you a criminal." Her attorney, a tired-looking man in his 50s, cleared his throat. "Mr. Bennett, my client is prepared to plead guilty to the charges in exchange for a suspended sentence and probation. She's also willing to agree to a no-contact order and to cease all legal challenges to your father's will." I considered the offer. Part of me wanted to see Miranda face real consequences for her actions, but I also knew that a lengthy legal battle would only prolong the pain and drama for everyone involved. More importantly, I'd found something else in my father's papers that had given me a different perspective on the whole situation. Among his financial records, I'd discovered that he'd been supporting Miranda's elderly mother in a nursing home, paying for her care out of his own pocket without ever telling Miranda about it. The payments had been going on for 3 years, totaling nearly $30,000. It was clear that despite his growing frustration with Miranda's behavior, my father had still felt some sense of responsibility for her family. "I'll agree to the plea deal," I told her attorney, "but I have some conditions of my own." Miranda looked up sharply, probably expecting me to make some impossible demand for restitution or public humiliation. "I want Miranda to receive counseling for her gambling problem," I said. Both Miranda and her attorney looked confused. "Gambling problem?" the attorney asked. I pulled out copies of bank statements I'd found among my father's papers. My father was covering debts that Miranda had run up at the casino over the past 2 years. Nearly $40,000 in total. That's probably why she was so desperate to get a larger inheritance. She owed money to people who don't accept payment plans. Miranda's face went white. She'd obviously thought she'd hidden her gambling from everyone, including her attorney. The revelation explained so much about her increasingly desperate behavior over the past few months. "I'll pay for the counseling," I continued, "and I'll cover her living expenses for 6 months while she gets her life together. But after that, she's on her own, and she stays out of my life permanently." Her attorney looked relieved. This was a much better deal than his client deserved. Miranda herself seemed torn between gratitude and resentment. probably struggling with the fact that I was showing her more generosity than she'd shown me. "Why would you do that?" she asked quietly. I thought about my father's letter, about the kind of man he'd wanted me to become, about the difference between justice and revenge. Because my father would have wanted me to do the right thing, even if you didn't. The legal proceedings wrapped up quickly after that. Miranda pleaded guilty to reduced charges, accepted the counseling requirement, and signed agreements that permanently ended any claim she might have had on my father's estate. Within a month, she'd moved out of state to live with her sister while she got treatment for her gambling addiction. I never heard from her again, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. With Miranda out of the picture, I was finally able to properly grieve for my father and process the complex legacy he'd left me. The money was life-changing, of course. It meant I could pay off my student loans, buy a house, and even start my own law practice if I wanted to. But more important than the financial inheritance was the understanding I'd gained about the man who'd raised me from a distance. Going through his personal belongings, I found evidence of a father who'd been quietly proud of my accomplishments, even if he'd never known how to express it. There were newspaper clippings of cases I'd worked on, a copy of my law school graduation announcement that he'd kept in his desk drawer, and even printouts of online articles about the law firm where I worked. He'd been following my career more closely than I'd ever imagined. I also found letters he'd written but never sent, birthday cards with messages about how proud he was to see me becoming an independent, ethical person, Christmas notes expressing hope that we might someday have a closer relationship, and even a letter from when I'd first started law school, where he wrote about his confidence that I'd use my legal education to help people rather than just make money. Reading those unsent letters was both heartbreaking and healing. My father hadn't been distant because he didn't care. He'd been distant because he didn't know how to bridge the gap that had formed during my childhood, and later because he'd respected my need to build my own life without his interference. The most powerful letter was one he'd written just a month before his death. "I know I failed you as a father in many ways, but watching you become the man you are today tells me that maybe I didn't fail completely. You have integrity, compassion, and strength that you developed on your own. I'm leaving you everything not because I think you need it, but because I trust you to use it wisely. Make your own choices about what kind of life you want to build, and know that I'll be proud of you either way." 6 months after the whole ordeal ended, I made the decision to use part of my inheritance to start my own law practice, specializing in elder law and estate planning. Too many families go through the kind of chaos that Miranda had created, often because people don't understand their legal rights, or don't have proper documentation to protect themselves from manipulation. My first client was an elderly man whose adult children were pressuring him to sign over power of attorney so they could help manage his finances. After talking with him for an hour, it became clear that his children were more interested in gaining access to his bank accounts than in providing genuine assistance. We worked together to create a comprehensive estate plan that protected his interests while still providing for his family's legitimate needs. Working with cases like that helped me understand what my father had been going through with Miranda. It's not always easy to recognize when someone's care and concern crosses the line into manipulation and control, especially when you want to believe that the people closest to you have your best interests at heart. I kept my father's house and moved into it, transforming his study into my home office. Sometimes when I'm working late on a difficult case, I'll think about the notebook he kept documenting Miranda's behavior, and I'm struck by how carefully he was trying to protect not just his assets, but his autonomy and dignity as well. The most surprising discovery came almost a year later, when I was cleaning out the basement and found a box of items my father had been collecting for me over the years. There were photos of me from law school graduation that I'd never seen before, copies of legal briefs I'd written that had somehow made their way to him, and even a bottle of expensive whiskey with a note that said for Lucas's first big case victory dated 2 years earlier. At the bottom of the box was a final letter, this one sealed and marked for Lucas. On his 30th birthday, or when he's ready to forgive an imperfect father, whichever comes first. Since my 30th birthday was still over a year away, I took the ready to forgive option and opened it. Son, if you're reading this, it means you've worked through the anger and disappointment that I know I caused by being such a distant father. I want you to know that every decision I made, including marrying Miranda, was my attempt to build a stable life that would benefit you in the long run. I failed in many ways, But I succeeded in raising a son who doesn't need anyone else's approval to know his own worth. That's the greatest achievement of my life. The money I'm leaving you isn't payment for putting up with my failings as a father. It's seed money for the good you're going to do in the world. Build something meaningful with it. Help people who need help. And remember that being alone isn't the same thing as being lonely. Sometimes the most important relationships are the ones where both people have the space to become who they're meant to be. I kept that letter on my desk for months, rereading it whenever I had a difficult day or a challenging case. My father had understood me better than I'd ever given him credit for, and his final gift wasn't just financial security. It was permission to forgive both him and myself for the relationship we'd never quite managed to build. Today, my law practice is thriving, and I've helped dozens of families navigate the complex emotional and legal challenges that come with estate planning and elder care. I think my father would be proud of the work I'm doing, and I know he'd be satisfied to see that Miranda never got the chance to destroy what he'd spent his lifetime building. I learned that sometimes the people who seem closest to you are the ones planning to take everything away. But I also learned that love doesn't always come with words. Sometimes it comes with protection you never knew existed, and wisdom that only reveals itself when you're finally ready to receive it. My father taught me that being generous doesn't mean being naive, and that the greatest inheritance isn't money. It's the judgment to know who deserves your trust and who's simply waiting for the right moment to betray it.